So a number of you have asked me about my writing, about my novel in particular, and how it's going, and thank you for your interest. It's going very well. As I mentioned in previous videos, I've recently finished a novel writing course and I have started the novel. I have the whole story effectively plotted out. I know where I'm going with it, I know who's in it, I know what the characters need to go through and what needs to happen and how they need to change and all those kind of things. So there is a story there waiting to be told, and I'm looking forward to going on and telling it. However, I'm still in quite early stages of that. I've literally just drafted the outline and drafted the first chapter. So the actual work of completing the novel is some way off. But I'm getting there, and as I've said before, I will share with you how I'm getting on as I go along. But that got me to thinking about something else that I've written, something I wrote a while ago, another piece of fiction that I wrote a while ago. And it's a short story that I actually wrote, gosh, it must be about 15 years ago now, and I wrote it for a short story competition that I was going to enter. And the short story competition was for children's short stories, and I can't really remember the criteria of it now, but I started the process of writing the story, and quite quickly my story exceeded the word limit of the competition, and I was faced with a choice. Either I changed the story and entered the competition, or I abandoned the competition and carried on with the story, and I chose to do the latter. Mainly because I was having such a good time writing the story, and it just felt right. So that story is one that I probably at some point will rework and might even publish, maybe as a children's storybook, maybe a children's picture book of some sort. I haven't absolutely decided how I'm going to do that. But I thought what I could do in the interim, as a way of getting it out there and into the world, is share it with you and actually read you the story here on my channel. So that's what I'm going to do. So if you're sitting comfortably, then whether you want this as a bedtime story or just as a general story, sit back and enjoy the tale of Tam MacFadyen meets the Loch Ness dragon. One day, not so long ago, when the sun was high in the sky, and the sky was the brightest blue you could possibly imagine, Tam MacFadyen and his parents arrived in the little village of Drumnadrochit. They had hired a pretty little cottage in the village so that they could spend a week having a holiday. They had travelled far, all the way from Dundee, and they were all very tired. Tam's mum and dad were tired because they both had jobs and worked very hard, and Tam, who was 7 years old, was tired because he had just finished his second year at primary school. He mostly enjoyed school, but he did find that he was quite worn out at the end of the week after doing lots of thinking. Now, for those of you who don't know, Drumnadrochit sits on the banks of Loch Ness, way up in the north of Scotland. Loch Ness is the biggest body of water in the whole of the United Kingdom. In fact, it's so big, it's said that every human being in the world could fit into it, with room to spare. All the water would have to be emptied out first, of course. But it wasn't the size of the loch that made Tam's heart beat hard with excitement as his dad parked their car outside the holiday cottage. It was because Tam had heard that something lived in the loch, not just fishes and underwater plants, but something very big and very scary. A monster. He'd read all about it in a book he'd found at school called The Legend of the Loch Ness Monster. It had some pictures of the monster in it, but they weren't very clear. Tam thought it might be huge, with big bulging eyes and green scaly skin, and long fingers with razor-sharp claws at the ends of them. In fact, he was quite sure it was the most terrifying thing in the whole world, and that it probably would eat him up right in one mouthful, just as soon as look at him. He couldn't wait to go exploring to see if he could find it. The other reason Tam was glad to be on holiday in Drum, that's what the local people called the village, since it was easier to say than Drumnadrochit and used up much less breath, was because he didn't really like the people he went to school with. Or rather, it was because he felt that they didn't really like him. Tam was the smallest boy in his class, and the skinniest. He wore big glasses with thick lenses which made his eyes look big and his head looked small. He had pale legs with little knobbly knees. He wasn't very good at any of the things that the other boys were good at, like football, and he didn't like sports much anyway. He liked to read books most of all, but the other boys laughed at him because of this, or would steal his books and hide them. Sometimes Tam felt quite sad and very lonely when he was at school. But as he stood looking beyond the cottage, at the loch sparkling in the distance down in the valley, and with a whole week of holidays stretching ahead of him, he didn't feel lonely at all. He just felt excited. Once Tam and his parents had unpacked and eaten their lunch, Tam's mum said, "What would you like to do now?" Tam didn't hesitate for a moment. "Let's go monster hunting," he cried, his eyes wide with anticipation. Tam's dad laughed. "Don't be daft, Tam. There's no such things as monsters. That's all a fairy tale." Tam's heart sank. His mum must have noticed that he looked disappointed to hear this, because she said, "Never mind, Tam. We can still go hunting for some fish for tea. Let's go into Drum and see what we can find." So off they went. When they got into the village, Tam was surprised at how busy it was. He was sure there must be hundreds of people milling about, and most of them seemed to be going into a particular building. It was a big grey building which looked a bit to Tam like a castle, although it was actually much smaller than most castles, and in fact used to be a hotel. "What's in there, Dad?" asked Tam. Tam's dad coughed and looked uncomfortable and said, "Oh, it's just that daft exhibition about monsters. But it's all just made up, just to make money out of silly tourists." Tam's mum laughed. "Oh, don't be so miserable. You never know, there might be a monster." Tam's heart leapt in his chest when he heard this. "Come on, let's go in." Even Tam's dad laughed then. "Aye, okay, let's have a look. We're on holiday after all." He picked Tam up and swung him onto his shoulders, and the three of them went through the entrance of the big grey building. Tam loved the exhibition. He saw some more photos of the monster, and even though his dad said they weren't really photos of a monster, just clever tricks of the camera, Tam knew in his heart that the monster was real. He learned that lots of people in Drum had seen the monster over the years, but that no one had ever been able to find it when they went looking for it. It seemed to only appear when it wanted to, not when others wished that it would. Tam thought that this was very sensible of the monster. He wished that he could do that sometimes. He also learned something very important. He learned that the monster had a name, and that name was Nessie. When Tam and his parents came out of the exhibition, about an hour later, the sun had gone in, the clouds had come out, and a light rain was drizzling down from the sky, making the village look a little darker and a little wetter and a lot more mysterious. In fact, a slight mist was swirling into the village over the surface of the loch, which Tam could just see in the distance beneath the jagged mountains on the horizon. "Now this is monster weather," thought Tam. "Nessie's bound to come out in this." Just as he was wondering how he could convince his mum and dad to let him go and look for Nessie, he heard a commotion from behind him. Several big white vans had pulled up outside the exhibition, and lots of men and women in white coats were getting out of them. The men and women all had very serious expressions on their faces, and they were all carrying a different piece of machinery. Tam noticed that some of the pieces of equipment looked like video cameras, and some seemed to be tape recorders, but he just didn't know what all the other machines could be. He found himself staring at a tall lady with long red hair, who was holding a particularly puzzling piece of equipment, a short, fat silver pole which had two red pulsing lights on either side of it, lots of thin copper wires wrapped around its middle, and a big thick black cable coming from between these wires and snaking into the back of one of the vans, where it disappeared from view. It also had a handle, a bit like the handle of a gun. The lady with the red hair was gripping this tightly and seemed to be aiming the whole contraption in the direction of the loch, as though she was going to shoot something. She had big eyes, which had a very pale, watery blue colour. Tam noticed that they stuck out a bit, which made her look as though she was staring very intently at the loch. She must have noticed him looking at her, because she turned and looked straight at him, lowered the strange machine and said, "Aye, laddie, and you'll no doubt be wondering what this is. Tam was a bit surprised when he realised that she was talking to him. Adults didn't usually talk to him, apart from his mum and dad and Mrs. Moneyfeith, his school teacher. But he gripped his dad's hand a bit tighter and said, "Oh, yes, I was." "Well, laddie, this here is known as a Piscepus Terrorarius circuit, or in everyday language, a fish frightener." A pisky, a fish frightener? But why do you need a machine like that to frighten fish? Can't you just use a fishing pole? Asked Tam, feeling rather puzzled. "Tam, don't be cheeky," hissed his mum. "I'm terribly sorry, he's just very curious. Hello, I'm Mary MacFadyen. This is my husband Tom, and this little terror is wee Tam." The lady with the long red hair turned her head slowly to look at Tam's mum. She simply peered at her for a moment or two, and tilted her head slightly to the side, as though she was examining Tam's mum the way a scientist would examine a specimen in a laboratory. And then slowly, the corners of her mouth began to turn up, and her lips began to part, and she smiled crookedly, showing some very big, pearly teeth. Tam thought she looked a little bit like a fish herself when she smiled, but he decided it was probably better not to say so. "Oh, that's no problem. I enjoy curious children," she said, and her tongue flickered quickly across her lips. "My name is Dr. McKracken." She turned back to Tam. "Well, laddie, the reason we need this contraption is not so we can catch the fish in the loch. Oh no, we have a bigger thing to catch than fish." She smiled again, wider this time, showing even more teeth. Tam took a step backwards, closer to his dad. "It's just to make them feel a wee bit uncomfortable. You see, we'll stick this end in the loch." She wiggled the metal pole in the air. "Then we'll turn it on and it will send out a very loud radio signal which can only be heard by the fish. This will scare them and make them all swim away from the noise and out of the loch." Tam scrunched up his eyebrows. He always did this when he was thinking, particularly when he was thinking about something that didn't quite make sense. He often did it at school when he was doing sums. "But," said Tam, still confused, "why would you want to make all the fish swim out of the loch?" The lady with the red hair and big teeth and bulging eyes leaned slowly forward and down so that her nose was level with Tam's, and looked him straight in the eye. Her eyes looked immensely big, and she was so close that Tam could smell her perfume. It smelled of old moss and dark, wet places. Tam tried not to wrinkle his nose. "Well, laddie, we want the fish to leave the loch so that there's no food left in it for hungry creatures which like to eat fish. No food for a monster, for example, like our dear old friend Nessie." Tam gasped. She went on, "Because then he'll have to show his big, ugly face, won't he, to find food, and then crack!" She slapped her hands together in front of Tam's face, making him jump. "We'll have him!" And with that, she straightened up, turned back to the van, and shouted at the other people in white coats. "Right, everyone, let's go catch that monster." That night, Tam just couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned in his bed, worrying about Nessie. His mum and dad had reassured him that there was nothing to worry about, and that Dr. McKracken wouldn't catch the monster. McKracken by name, McKracken by nature, his dad had said before being shushed by his wife. Tam knew that they only thought that because they didn't believe there was a monster in the loch in the first place. He knew differently. There was a monster, and it would starve without any fish to eat. As he lay there watching the moonlight glimmering between his bedroom curtains, he knew he had to do something. He had to save the Loch Ness monster. Very quietly, so his mum and dad wouldn't hear him, they were sound asleep in the bedroom next door, Tam got out of bed. He got dressed as quietly and as quickly as he could, and put on a warm jacket and a pair of wellies. He tiptoed through the house, taking care not to stand on any creaky floorboards. He went into the kitchen where he picked up his dad's torch and then looked in the fridge. It didn't take him long to find what he was looking for, some leftover fish from tea time. This will keep Nessie going for a while, thought Tam, and put it into his jacket pocket. Tam had never ventured out on his own at night time before, and he was a little bit nervous as he stepped out of the kitchen door into the moonlit garden. But he knew he had to be brave for Nessie's sake. The only other people who seemed to believe that Nessie even existed were the strange people in white coats and Dr. McKracken, and they just wanted to catch the poor creature. Tam knew that he was the only one who could stop them. So he took a deep breath, turned on the torch, and set off across the garden, over the fields, down the hill, and towards Loch Ness. It didn't take Tam long to reach the loch, and as he got closer, he soon realised that he wasn't the only one out wandering in the night. From behind the trees which grew all along the side of the loch, he could see glimmers of light, and he could hear voices. He crept as quietly as he could in the direction of the lights, trying to stay out of sight in the shadows of the trees. As he got closer, he was able to see where the lights and voices were coming from. It was one of the white vans. It was parked close to the edge of the water, and trailing from behind it was the long black cable he had seen earlier that day. It wound round the side of the van towards the loch, and there at the edge of the water stood Dr. McKracken, holding the fish frightener. She had the silver end of it dipped in the water, and Tam could see an eerie red light glowing from its end and shining out into the loch. "Not long now," said Dr. McKracken to a man in a white coat who was standing beside her. "The fish must all be nearly gone. Old Nessie will know something's wrong soon, and will have to come out of the water to look for food. Take your men and start searching the edge of the loch. Take the nets. Catch the monster." The man nodded once and headed off behind the van. Tam knew he couldn't waste any time. He had to find Nessie first. He tiptoed as quietly as he could, away from the van and the lights and Dr. McKracken, and as soon as he was sure he would be out of earshot, broke into a run. He knew the men wouldn't be far behind, but he hoped that if he ran fast enough he'd find the place at the water's edge where Nessie would come out looking for food. He hoped it would be soon, as his little legs were already getting tired, and he knew that the men in white coats would soon catch him up. Tam ran for what seemed like hours, until at last his legs just wouldn't carry him any further. He was gasping for air, and although he tried to breathe quietly, he was sure he must sound just like a wheezy old steam engine. He leant against a tree at the edge of a small glade in the forest, and he caught his breath, looking around him. It was very dark where he stood, as even the moon had disappeared behind a thick blanket of cloud. He listened for the sound of running feet or a van's engine, but couldn't hear anything but his own ragged, gasping breaths. He felt relieved. At least the men in white coats weren't too close yet. He still had time to find Nessie first, although he didn't know how he would manage. He was so tired he could barely stand, let alone keep searching the bank of the loch. Then he heard a low, rumbling growl. It came from behind him. He felt like his heart would stop beating, he felt so frightened. Slowly he turned his head in the direction of the noise. At first he couldn't see anything, just some tree stumps and piles of leaves in the dark of the woods. Then, as his eyes got used to the darkness, he realised that what he thought had been a pile of leaves was actually a long, green, thick tail. And what he thought had been a tree stump was actually a huge, green head. Two big, shining eyes blinked open in the head, swivelled round, and looked straight at him. As he stood there staring, Tam realised that he was looking at the Loch Ness monster, and it was looking back at him. It was lying on the ground with its head resting on its forearms and its tail snaking behind its body between the trees. He couldn't even see the end of the tail because it was so long it disappeared into the darkness. Tam had never seen such a big animal before in his life. It looked a bit like an enormous crocodile, or perhaps a lizard of some sort. "Nessie!" gasped Tam. The creature continued to look straight at Tam. It sighed, a long, weary sigh, as though it was very tired. And then, to Tam's utter astonishment, the creature spoke. "Nessie," it growled. "That's not my name. That is a silly name given to me by silly people who don't really believe I exist. My name is Flamafray." It said this last word as though it was terribly important. Its voice was low and rumbling and sounded a bit like pebbles tumbling together in a deep well. "Oh, I'm sorry," said Tam. "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Flamafray. My name is Tam MacFadyen." Rumbled the creature. "Just Flamafray." "Hello, Tam MacFadyen. Simple enough. I suppose people don't have trouble saying your name." Tam thought he caught a glimpse of a smile. "No, most people don't. Tam is short for Thomas, although some people call me silly names as well," he said, and hung his head. "Oh," said the creature. "Some of the boys at school, they call me Shorty and Specky Four Eyes, even though they know my name is Tam. My mum tells me to ignore them. She told me a rhyme to say when they call me names." "Did she?" growled Flamafray. "And what rhyme is that?" Tam swallowed and stood up straight. "It goes, 'Sticks and stones may break my bones, but names can never hurt me.'" A strange noise began to come from the direction of the creature, a sound like gravel being shaken around in a metal tray. At first Tam thought it was the sound of the white van approaching, and he looked around anxiously for any sign of its headlights. He saw nothing, and as he turned back towards the creature, he realised what the sound was. It was laughter, and it was coming from the Loch Ness monster. "Very good," chortled the creature. "That is a clever little rhyme." It sighed then, and Tam noticed a thin wisp of steam coming from its mouth. "Sadly, though, it isn't true. Come closer to me, Tam, so I can see you better." Tam did as the creature asked, stepping away from the tree he had been leaning against and sitting down on a rock nearer to Flamafray. Up close, he saw that the creature's skin looked a bit like the skin of the crocodiles he'd read about in a book at school. It looked tough and thick and covered in a beautiful pattern of many different shades of green. The creature continued. "Names can hurt us, Tam," it said. "I have been hurt when I've learned that people now call me Nessie, and that the world has forgotten the majesty of my true name. And no doubt you have been hurt when people have called you the silly names you have described." Tam nodded. "Well, Tam, I have something to tell you. The false names that others call us can hurt, but they can't change the most important thing of all, and that's what we call ourselves." "I," said the creature, and it lifted its head from the ground and thrust out its chin in what Tam felt was a most regal fashion. "I am Flamafray, and you," and it turned its head towards Tam and fixed him with its big, glittering eyes, "you are Tam MacFadyen, no matter what anyone else calls us. Agreed?" Tam smiled and felt his heart swell with pride. The Loch Ness monster knew his name and thought it was important. "Agreed," he said. The creature lowered its head to the ground once more, and Tam noticed that it did so almost gingerly, as though it was in pain. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "I'm tired," said Flamafray, "just very tired. Anyway, Tam, now that we're introduced, I have a question for you. Most people don't usually get as far as finding out my real name. They usually run away and make up names for me after they've gone. Why aren't you frightened of me, Tam?" And Tam thought he saw a faint, mischievous glimmer in its eyes. "I don't really know," he replied, and thought for a moment. "Well, I suppose it's because I came looking for you. It would be silly to be frightened of you now that I've found you, wouldn't it?" "You came looking for me?" said the creature, and Tam saw that it looked surprised. "Yes, to save you from the monster hunters," said Tam. "Monster hunters?" growled the creature, and its eyes blazed angrily. "Another false name they call me. I am no monster. I am a dragon." At this it raised its head once more, opened its mouth, and let out a short, roaring blaze of flames, which almost set fire to the trees nearby. Tam jumped back from the sudden heat. "Don't!" he hissed. "They'll see the flames. They're already looking for you." Flamafray growled. "Let them come. I will fight them to the end. They shall not capture me alive. It was Tam's turn to sound cross. No one is catching anyone, he said, and this time it was his chin which was raised in defiance. I came to rescue you, and that's what I'm going to do. Now, have you eaten? The creature sighed again, and a thin wisp of smoke puffed out of its mouth. There is nothing left to eat, Tam. The fish have gone from the water. I suspected this was the work of the humans. They have removed my only source of food, and now I don't even have enough strength to fly away to find more. It was kind of you to come to help me, but you should go now. When they come for me, I will breathe fire until my last breath. You should go now to safety. No, said Tam, you can't give up. I didn't come all this way to listen to you give up. Here. He fumbled in his jacket pocket and pulled out the fish he'd brought from the fridge. Eat this. It'll give you some strength at least. He dropped the fish in front of Flamafrey, who gobbled it up hungrily. Although the fish was tiny and must have seemed like a mere crumb of food to Flamafrey, the creature looked gratefully at Tam. Thank you, Tam MacFadyen, it said. Now I need to find some more food, said Tam, and scratched his head. He hadn't really thought of what to do next. Just then, Tam heard a noise. Flamafrey heard it too, and both their heads turned in the direction of the sound. It was still far away, but it was unmistakable and getting closer. It was the sound of an engine. The monster hunters were on their way. Tam knew he had to think quickly. He looked around him, wondering what to do to help Flamafrey. Suddenly, he had an idea. Flamafrey, I know what to do. Will you trust me? The creature, who had begun to growl softly as though preparing himself for a final terrible battle, stopped and looked at Tam, blinking. Trust you? Yes, to help you. To do what I say and to not fight or to breathe fire or to make a noise. Flamafrey's eyes glittered in the darkness, and Tam could hear the creature's breath sighing in and out of its weary lungs. Yes, Tam MacFadyen, I shall trust you. You have a noble name and I shall trust you. Good. Well, there's no time to lose. You must go back in the water before they see you. Flamafrey sighed again. If I go back in the water, I will die, Tam MacFadyen. I need food, and will not have the strength to leave the water again unless I can eat. There are no fish in the water. If I return to it, I shall never leave it again. You said you'd trust me, said Tam, upset. Please, I know what I'm doing. Get back in the water just for a little while. I have to go now. Get in the water and wait. You'll know if I've succeeded. Please? He turned then, and began to head back in the direction from which he'd come. As he reached the edge of the glade, he turned and faced Flamafrey, who had begun to shuffle towards the water's edge with slow, painful movements. Goodbye, Flamafrey, said Tam, and good luck. Goodbye, Tam MacFadyen, said the creature, sadly. Tam turned and ran towards the sound of the approaching van. He had been running for just a short time when he saw the van driving along a dirt track at the water's edge. It was heading in the direction of the glade towards the place where he had left Flamafrey. He felt sure the creature couldn't have had time to get back into the water yet. He knew what he had to do. He ran directly towards the van, waving his arms frantically straight into its path. The van's horn sounded and he could hear the squeal of brakes. He closed his eyes, half expecting to be hit, but instead he heard a skidding sound and then silence. It had stopped just yards from him. The doors of the van flew open and out jumped several men in white coats and one woman with red hair. It was Dr. McKracken. You stupid wee boy, she shouted as she strode towards him, shining a torch in his face. What do you think you're doing? You could have killed us all. And what on earth are you doing out at this time of night? Surely your parents... She stopped. He couldn't see her clearly because of the light she was shining in his face, but he guessed that she must have stopped because she recognised him. His heart was thumping so hard in his chest, he was sure she would be able to see it beating underneath all his clothes. But he knew there was no time to worry, nor to waste. Dr. McKracken, he gasped. I'm so glad I've found you. It's the monster, Dr. McKracken. I've seen him. I've seen Nessie. Dr. McKracken immediately turned off the torch and strode towards Tam. He could see her more clearly now by the light of the van's headlights. He noticed again how tall she was, the redness of her hair, and as she smiled down at him, her big teeth, and he could smell the dark, mossy smell. "Nessie," she said softly, stroking her chin. "Really? How very interesting. It's Tom, isn't it?" she said, crouching down so that her eyes were level with his. Yes," said Tam, not bothering to correct her. "Well, Tom, perhaps you would be good enough to show us where you saw the creature. We're on a very important scientific mission, as you know, and it's very important that we find the monster. Perhaps there would be a little reward in it for you, She cupped his chin with her hand, which was cold and clammy. Tam felt his skin crawl, but he didn't flinch. "Yes, he went that way," and he pointed back up the dirt track in the direction they had travelled from. "He was swimming towards the end of the loch very fast." Dr. McKracken straightened up quickly and turned around. She scratched her head, looking puzzled. "That end of the loch? How strange. That isn't what we expected at all. He should be heading the other way in the direction of the remaining fish. There are no fish at that end of the loch and haven't been for hours, not since we put the fish frightener in the water." She looked down at Tam. "I think, Tom, that you are mistaken. The monster must be going this way," and she looked down the dirt track in the direction of the glade. Tam felt his pulse quicken. "Come on," said Dr. McKracken to the men in white coats. "We've wasted enough time talking here. We need to keep going. We'll find the monster soon, I'm sure." And she turned back to the van. Tam swallowed hard. "Wait," he said. Dr. McKracken stopped and turned back to look at him. "Dr. McKracken, I did see Nessie heading that way. I think I know why. It's because it's going to attack the fish frightener. While you're up at this end looking for him, it'll destroy it, and then all the fish will come back for him to eat." "Attack the fish frightener?" laughed Dr. McKracken. "How ridiculous! How could a stupid creature like that attack—" She frowned. "Wait. It's possible, I suppose. The monster may be more intelligent than we thought, and if it does get to the machine—" "Quickly," said Tam, hoping the panic in his voice would make her panic too. "He must be nearly there by now." It obviously worked. She whirled round and ran back to the van, barking orders at the men in white coats. "Let's get back! To the fish frightener!" she shouted. "You," she pointed at Tam, "come with me. If you know what he looks like, you can keep a watch out for him. If you want that reward, you'll need to work for it." She smiled a crooked, toothy smile, which was more of a sneer, and which told Tam that she was lying about the reward. Not that he minded. If his plan worked, he'd have the greatest reward of all. It took them just 15 minutes to get back to the fish frightener. It was just as Tam had seen it earlier that night, submerged in the water near the bank, glowing its eerie red glow into the depths of the loch. After getting out of the van, Tam, Dr. McKracken and the men in white coats gathered around the strange contraption and gazed out across the water, which was perfectly still. Tam noticed that there was a faint glow on the horizon. The sun was beginning to rise. He thought for a moment about his parents. They would be getting up soon and would notice that he was gone. He had to act fast, for Flamifrey's sake, and for his own. Dr. McKracken was clearly not happy. She paced up and down nearby, shooting glances at the loch every few seconds. "There is no sign of the monster, Tom," she hissed at Tam. "He would be here by now if he was swimming as fast as you say. I knew this was a stupid idea. I should never have listened to such nonsense." She spun on her heels and pointed at one of the men in white coats. "You! Take the van and head back to the other end of the loch. Wherever that monster is, I want it found." Tam took his chance because he knew it was the last chance he had. "Look!" he shouted and pointed out at the loch. "The monster! There it is!" As soon as the words were out of his mouth, there was an immediate commotion. Men in white coats began running everywhere, picking up cameras and other pieces of equipment. Dr. McKracken began shrieking excitedly, barking more orders, and swivelling her head from side to side like a demented owl, scanning the loch. Tam wouldn't have been surprised if her head had turned right round on her neck. She was moving it so vigorously. But he had little time for such thoughts, as he knew he had to carry out the next stage of his plan. In the midst of all the excitement, no one had noticed yet that there was nothing to be seen in the water, but they would soon. He bent down, wrapped his arms around the black cable of the fish frightener and tugged as hard as he could. At first, nothing happened. He just felt his arms straining against the thick black cable which was fixed to the metal head in the water. Then suddenly, it came away from the head in a shower of green and blue sparks, and with a loud bang, more shouting. This time, there were angry voices all around him, and he felt himself being picked up roughly by the scruff of the neck and dragged away from the broken machine. "No! What are you doing?" bellowed Dr. McKracken, for it was she who had grabbed him. His feet were dangling in the air, several inches off the ground, and he felt dizzy and sick as the hood of his jacket was tightening around his neck, making him fight for breath. "You've ruined it! Do you understand how expensive that machine is, you stupid wee boy? I have a good mind to throw you into the Loch. Can you swim, eh? Shall we see?" If Tam had been able to speak, he would have been able to tell her that no, he couldn't swim, but he was barely able to breathe. She twisted her arm around so that Tam swung round to face her and pulled him close to her so that their noses were almost touching. This close, Tam could just see her big bulging eyes, which looked quite mad. She hissed, "Yes, a nice little dip in the water before we finish our monster hunt. That'll teach little boys not to break my toys." And her voice rose to a hysterical shriek as she began to march towards the water's edge, carrying Tam with her. He twisted and thrashed and kicked as hard as he could and tried to shout for help, but the grip on his throat was so tight he wasn't able to make a sound. "Oh well," thought Tam as he felt himself slipping into unconsciousness. "At least Flamifree will get some food now." He closed his eyes and waited to be dropped into the dark, cold depths of Loch Ness. "Put him down!" Tam stopped moving, and then he felt himself drop, not into icy water, but onto the soft, grassy bank at the water's edge. He gasped for air in ragged, painful breaths, and as his head began to clear, he saw to his surprise his mother striding towards them. She looked furious. He began thinking of what to say, how to explain why he was out of bed at this time of the morning, until he realised that she wasn't looking furiously at him, but at Dr. McKracken. He could see his father getting out of his car too, not far behind her. He seemed to be shouting angrily at the men in white coats, who were shrugging their shoulders and looking sheepish. "What is going on here?" said Tam's mother through pursed lips. Tam recognised that look. He felt almost sorry for Dr. McKracken. If his mother had pursed lips, Dr. McKracken didn't stand a chance. "Ah, Mrs. MacFadyen, well, I was just teaching little Tom here the value of other people's property. He has ruined my Piscepus Terrorarius circuit, which costs thousands of pounds. If you are unable to control your child and allow him to wander around all hours of the night, then you must expect—" "I do not expect to find my son being half strangled by you or anyone else," shouted Tam's mother. "His name is Tam, not Tom, and if he has done any damage, we will of course pay for it. And I do not allow him to wander around at all hours." She shot a look at Tam, and he knew that he wasn't off the hook. "But regardless of the circumstances, threatening to throw a 7-year-old boy who doesn't swim into freezing cold water is no way to handle the situation." "Mrs. MacFadyen, I hardly think you're in a position to—" "Oh, be quiet!" roared Tam's mum, and pushed Dr. McKracken straight into the loch. Tam couldn't believe it. He saw the doctor as though in slow motion, her arms flailing in the air, a look of horror and surprise on her face, and then saw her topple backwards from the force of his mother's push. Slowly she tipped back, red hair streaming in front of her face, and then, splash, she was in the water. It wasn't terribly deep, but it was deep enough to soak her from head to foot. She coughed and spluttered and thrashed her way to the bank, pulling herself half out of the water as she went. She was wringing wet and had weeds in her hair, which was plastered to her face. "Right you," barked Tam's mum, turning towards him. "I knew we'd find you down here. Home!" "But Mum," said Tam, wanting to tell her what had happened. "We'll have explanations later. Home!" Tam sighed, took his mum's hand and made his way towards his parents' car. He wondered how on earth he'd explain this one. They must have got up early and looked into his room to check on him and noticed that he'd gone. They'd come to the loch because they'd guessed he'd be looking for the monster. And that was the truth. But of course, they didn't believe there was a monster. He felt sure that he'd be grounded for years. And what about Flamifrey? Who would help him now? His dad was holding the back door of the car open, and as they approached, he expected him to start shouting too. But instead, he saw that his dad had a look of surprise on his face and was staring out across the loch. "I don't believe this," croaked Tam's dad. Tam followed his father's gaze. There, swimming across the water of the loch towards them all, was a huge, scaly green creature with bright, flashing eyes. "Flamifrey!" shouted Tam. The creature came to a halt in the water and floated for a moment or two. Then two huge wings unfurled from its back. They were a bit like the wings of a bat, although much bigger, and a kind of dark seaweed green. Flamifrey flapped them slowly and rose out of the water into the air. The men in white coats were standing absolutely still and looked utterly terrified. Dr. McKracken, who was standing on the banks of the loch dripping water from her soaking white lab coat, looked beside herself with a mixture of excitement and rage. She turned this way and that as though looking for something, but seeing that all of her assistants were quite motionless with fear, realised there was nothing she could do to capture the creature, and stamped her foot in frustration. Tam smiled. "It worked, Tam MacFadyen," growled Flamifrey in that familiar, rumbling voice. Several men in white coats fainted, and Tam felt his mum's hand tighten around his. "The fish?" said Tam. "They're coming back," said Flamifrey. "I have eaten well this night." He continued to flap his wings, rising higher into the sky. His voice became fainter as he went. "Good," said Tam. "Now you can find somewhere new to live." "Yes," said Flamifrey. "Loch Ness has been a good home to me for many years, but it is time for me to move on. It seems I am welcome here no more. I only hope that in the place I am going, I will find people as welcoming as you, Tam MacFadyen." "Where will you go?" said Tam, but as soon as he asked the question, he knew he could never have the answer. "I cannot tell you that," said the creature, "for there are too many unfriendly ears nearby. But I will find a good place to live, thanks to you." "Good," said Tam again, feeling his throat tighten partly with pride and partly with sadness. "I'm glad." "It has been an honour to meet you, Tam MacFadyen," said the creature, continuing to rise higher above the loch. "And you, Flamifrey?" "You will not see me again," said Flamifrey. "I know," said Tam, choking back tears. "But there are two things from this night which you must always remember." "What?" shouted Tam, so that the creature, who was now high in the sky, could hear him. "My name and yours." And with that, Flamifrey beat his big green wings more vigorously, turned in a graceful semicircle in the air, pointed his nose across the loch between two distant mountains, and flew swiftly towards the horizon. As the creature soared away into the distance, Tam heard his parting words rumbling across the loch towards him. "Goodbye, Tam MacFadyen, my friend." Tam couldn't speak, so he just waved and smiled. His dad was the first one to break the silence after the creature's departure. "I just don't believe this," he croaked again. Finally, Tam found his voice. "You see, Dad, I told you there was a Loch Ness monster." He stopped, remembering Flamifrey's words, and corrected himself. "A Loch Ness dragon," he finished proudly. The end.